Let's turn to the wide receivers. And it's interesting because you said that Allen Robinson was one of your disappointing players from the season in terms of traditional fantasy, and yet you insert him into your ultimate lineup with Adams and Cooks. Why'd you go that route?
I did. Well, partially, I think it's my Jaguars bias that's kind of creeping in, but he's so cheap now. I mean, he's almost $3,000 cheaper at 5,500 this week than he was at the beginning of the season. So you're getting a huge discount on a really talented player. So at some point, you kind of have to say, like, he's been disappointing, but he's so cheap that I think the talent is worth the upside here. And he finally did come alive last week. 12 targets, I should say, 9 catches, almost 150 yards, that Jags offense seemed a little bit energized by the coaching change. I mean, whipping out trick plays. Blake Bortles is catching touchdowns. Like, that's not something that was happening under Gus Bradley. So, maybe they found something. I don't know what it was as far as preparation, but Allen Robinson and Blake Bortles, these are the type of games we saw from them so often last season. So, we'll see. Week 17, not much on the line here for the Jaguars. I don't see why they don't try to recapture that. Davante Adams, like we talked about, he's been much more consistent than expected, a top 8 receiver in terms of fantasy on the season. And then Brandon Cooks, he's had a few down weeks. A few weeks ago, I think he really hurt a lot of DFS owners, having 0 catches and 0 targets. But since then, he's rebounded nearly 200 yards combined over his last 2 weeks, had 2 touchdowns a couple weeks ago. And this Falcons defense has improved, but they're still not great. And the Saints have shown that they can score on anybody.
Yeah, that's why I have Cooks, and I actually went with Michael Thomas, and Cooks to go with Jordy Nelson. But I kind of like the Davante Adams thought too. Maybe I might have to insert him in place of one of the Saints guys, and then try to find a higher value. Because I went with Darren Sproles as my second running back. I know they're not playing for anything necessarily, but the fact that Dallas might be trying to sit some guys, and Sproles, I don't know. He gets points whenever he's in the game.
He does. Every year he does this. Every year you want to write him off. He always somehow becomes valuable around like week 8.
No, you're right. And he's only at $4,000. So it's just something that you can insert and still get some of the higher priced talent in some other positions.
Nick, I'm assuming you went with Kelce at tight end because you feel like the drop off after him is significant and you'd rather pay the money there. One thing that would worry me, though, I'm always coming from a down week to have a bounce back week. You can't have a bigger week than Kelce had a week ago. He's not going to be able to duplicate that, but you still think he's worthy of going with this week?
I do. I think there's such a gap, especially with Gronkowski hurt in terms of the elite tight ends. After Kelce, the options to me just weren't that intriguing this week. He goes up against a San Diego defense that's below average against the pass. And I do typically employ that strategy that you mentioned, don't bet on 2 huge performances in a row. And, last week, 11 catches on 12 targets, 160 yards and a score. Like, he's not going to replicate that. But, prior to that, he had at least 100 yards in 4 of his last 5 games. The target volume, of course, wasn't quite as high. So I think he's shown that, he's certainly capable of stringing together, back-to-back strong performances. Does he get to 160? Probably not. But can he get to 110 or even 120? I think that's very much feasible.
I agree with you on Kelce. He's like really the only option there at tight end. Ty Montgomery, you have him at flex. If you go with Montgomery as your running back, one of your 2 running backs, who else would you recommend in the flex spot?
One guy I really like is Thomas Rawls. He was somebody that I was hesitant, putting this lineup together. Yesterday there were still some questions about his availability, but he did put in a full practice Wednesday. And Rawls, I think the ownership should be relatively low, just because I think a lot of people will look at his numbers from last week and maybe be a little bit scared away. But you got to look at the matchup here. I mean, he's going up against San Francisco, which is just hemorrhaging points to running backs and hemorrhaging yards at an alarming rate. And this is a San Francisco team, that'll I'm sure will get up, to play Seattle, a division rival in Week 17. But they really haven't been able to put up a fight against any running back in the last several weeks.